What's the worst movie you've ever seen? I don't mean something you walked out of the theater for. I'm talking about so bad it's good, can't be over-the-top nonsense. My mother once described my taste in films as ones that are old and not very good, and she's not wrong. But if you're like me and have a certain fondness for films that are, admittedly, old and not very good, then let me tell you about one of the campiest, most melodramatic moments in film history, the 1970s disaster movie craze. Unlike the dime a dozen painfully low-budget drudgery that defines the state of the disaster film genre in 2023 and seems to dominate much of Netflix's current library of content, disaster films of the 1970s were true blockbuster events, with big-name stars like Burt Lancaster, Gene Hackman, and even the guy from The Salad Dressing. It's absolutely true that these films definitely don't hold up from a writing perspective. There is so much casual misogyny and racism in these films that, over the course of writing this script, I have had to pause as I'm watching them and just kind of recover from certain lines of dialogue. However, I do think these films have a lot to offer in terms of technique, style, and just plain fun, even if watching them does occasionally make me want to tear my hair out. While the stylistic hallmarks of disaster film production fell out of style in the early 1980s, many hallmarks of the narrative and directorial sensibilities of the genre are still visible in films today. That's why I'm going to take a look at some of the most impactful films of the genre and break down the qualities that make each of them so unique. When discussing the disaster film movement of the 1970s, most film historians cite Airport, which was released in 1970, as the quote-unquote originator of the genre. Set at the fictional Chicago Lincoln Airport, a clear analog for O'Hare, the film follows the airport's manager, Mel Bakersfeld, played by Burt Lancaster, as he and customer relations manager Tanya Livingston, played by Gene Seberg, navigate a series of incidents that begins with an airliner stuck in a snowdrift and ends with a domestic terrorism event. Side note, please bear in mind that this film was made 31 years before the events of the War on Terror, and the last half of the film really kind of has a ha-ha, wouldn't it be terrible if this happened in real life kind of vibe that just feels really awkward in the post-Bush era. My own politics aside, I do have to say that having just flown out of O'Hare and having gone through the absolute Sisyphean nightmare that is TSA there, I do kind of wonder if it's possible to directly trace the release of Airport all the way through the War on Terror to 53 years later when I have to pour out my soda into the O'Hare jungle juice receptacle because a glorified mall cop will yell at me if I try to take it through the metal detector. Anyway. From the opening moments of the film, it's clear that what we're watching is a project with a very large budget. Burt Lancaster, Dean Martin, and Gene Seberg all received top billing, and costumes for the film were designed by Edith Head, who famously designed Pan Am's stewardess uniforms. It's clear that Universal Studios was banking on the film's success, and for good reason. Airport was nominated for a total of 24 awards during the 1970-71 award season, and won 5 of them, including a Best Supporting Actress Academy Award for Helen Hayes, and a Grammy for Alfred Newman's original score. The film opens with a Boeing 707 becoming marooned in a snowdrift after its pilots misjudged their turn onto the taxiway. Lancaster's Mel Bakersfeld is notified of the issue and deduces that he'll have to remain at the airport until the issue is resolved. However, we're almost immediately informed that this incident and implied previous others have put rather a strain on Mel's marriage. From the outset, it's made very clear that the last thing on Mel's mind is his wife. He's more than willing to speak to Tanya, whom we'll discuss shortly, but his wife Sydney is overbearing not just from the moment we meet her, but even before.
Mr. Bakersfeld, white phone, urgent.
Bakersfeld,
Where the hell are you?
I'm on my way to the field. We've got an emergency.
You said you would be home at 6 o'clock. Now, you promised me you wouldn't miss this dinner. You promised that a week ago.
A week ago, I didn't know we'd have the worst storm in 6 years.
You've always got some damn excuse.
I'll call you back.
From the first glimpses we get of their relationship, we're told that Mrs. Bakersfeld is an impressive presence in Mel's life, as evidenced by the fact that he seems to know who's on the phone as soon as his phone starts ringing. He's loath to answer it because he knows his wife will immediately launch into berating him for exercising his freedom. The way that this film handles its female characters does a lot to mark it as a product of its time. We're implicitly instructed to empathize with the male characters in the film, such as Mel and his counterparts, who are variations on the everyman archetype, which becomes a common theme throughout disaster filmography. No matter how flippantly they treat their female compatriots, the film brushes off their transgressions, like absenteeism, cheating, which will become very relevant later in Airport, among other things, but condemns similar and often less egregious acts from female characters like Mrs. Bakersfeld. Objectively, it's understandable that she'd be at least a little bit miffed that Mel's backing out of his commitment to a dinner, which, as we'll see, could have significant implications not just to the Bakersfield family dynamic, but to Mel's career. But through Mrs. Bakersfeld's characterization, we're told to brush her off just like Mel does. Tanya, by contrast, is an ever-available shoulder for Mel to lean on. She's far more accessible than Mrs. Bakersfeld is, and by extension far more empathetic to both Mel and to the audience. But she's not made into the same everyman character that many of the male personalities in this film tend to embody. Her position as customer relations manager affords her proximity to the action, but prevents her from being masculinized by doing too much physical labor or interacting too directly with her male coworkers, with the notable exception of Mel. Their relationship transcends the boundaries of their shared work, and as a result, Tanya competes with Mrs. Bakersfeld for Mel's emotional availability. Meanwhile, we're introduced to Joe Petroni and Vernon Demarest, TGA's chief mechanic and a pilot, respectively. Vernon is Mel's brother-in-law and a captain for TGA. Tonight, he's doing a check-ride flight on one of his coworkers on a flight to Rome. We'll come back to him shortly.
Hello, Joe.
I'm Mel. Save your breath. Danny gave me the poop tonight. I'm not available.
Joe, I need you right away. I got 14 on the ground and 18 stacked upstairs.
And I've got our 5 kids stacked away at my mother so that me and Marie can be alone for a while.
Tell Marie I'm sorry to louse up her evening, but I need 2-9 badly.
Can't the global crew handle it?
Well, they're having a conference now to decide what to do. But I need somebody who knows, a genius, like Petroni.
Old whipped cream, I've just had dessert. All right, I'll be there.
Good.
In the meantime, give everybody a shovel and have them start digging a 10-degree incline in front of the wheels.
Right.
Out.
While it's clear that Joe and his wife seem to enjoy each other's company a lot more than Mel and Cindy do, the interaction between them and between Joe and Mel is written in such a way that it implies that Joe's wife is still dragging him backward, no matter how much he'd rather be with her than at work. And if you're thinking, wow, women really cannot catch a break in this movie, just wait, it gets so much worse. Vernon Demarest is Mel's brother-in-law and a captain on TGA. Tonight he's conducting a routine in-flight assessment on one of his fellow captains. Before he departs, he meets his mistress, a young, emphasis on young, flight attendant named Gwen Meehan. From her very first moments on screen, Gwen is treated as very little more than a sex object.
Vern, we just don't have time.
But I have a cab waiting downstairs, and we can make the airport in 15 minutes. Now, the driver doesn't mind waiting. His meter's running, and so is mine.
But I've got to finish packing.
You get me up to full throttle, then throw me into reverse. You could damage my engine that way.
Look, we'll be in Rome tomorrow. We'll have 3 days. Try a little patience.
Or a cold shower.
Think about something else.
Oh, that I like. You can see right through it.
As much as I enjoy these films, it's scenes like this that always kind of take me out of them. If you're cringing just from watching that little 30-second exchange, imagine how I feel. I've watched this movie like 6 times in the past week. The fact that Gwen is so much younger than Vernon in a position of much less relative power is played into to an almost nauseating degree. There is, however, an interesting contrast between Gwen and Vern's relationship and the ones we've seen thus far. Where Mel and Cindy are all but separated and Mrs. Petroni doesn't really exist as a character in this film beyond being a framing device for her husband's introduction, Gwen is portrayed as the quote-unquote ideal girlfriend/mistress. Her involvement with Vern has no real strings attached, at least not yet. That's foreshadowing. She's young, pretty, and most of all, she's accessible. By the nature of her job as a stewardess on TGA, she's close to Vern pretty much constantly, creating an optimal environment for an affair. Further, Mrs. Demarest, Vernon's wife and Mel's sister, outright states that she's not only aware of the fact that Vernon is cheating on her with a much younger woman, she's fine with it.
For my sake, be patient with him.
How you can live with that overage juvenile delinquent, I'll never know.
There's just the 2 of us. If I left him, what would I have?
Would you have any more if he decided to leave you?
He won't. The moment a girl gets too serious, he waves his wedding ring like a flag. I'm his disaster insurance.
More like group insurance.
Thanks for caring, Mel. Don't worry. Someday he'll come home for some other reason than to just change his clothes.
Well, I hope so.
Gwen is also a very clear foil for Mel's wife Cindy. Where Cindy is obstinate and frigid, Gwen is easygoing and flirtatious. We find out later that Cindy's father has offered Mel a job, one that would afford the family a much higher degree of financial stability. Mel, however, won't take it, clearly preferring the freedom from his wife that his job at the airport affords him. Even though Cindy's arguments are logical and taking the job would, objectively speaking, be a good decision for Mel's family, the film's narrative choices push us toward the idea that this is an overstep of bounds on Cindy's part, and that she's just stubborn and controlling. We also learn that Tanya is considering taking a job transfer to San Francisco, which Mel immediately steps in and protests. The camaraderie between him and Tanya takes a clear turn toward romance in this scene, where Mel confesses that the reason he won't take Cindy's father's job offer is because he's in love with Tanya. Despite this, he freely admits that breaking up his marriage would be a failure to his children, but notably not to his wife.
I tell myself I've got to try to hold things together. For the sake of the children. But I'm not sure that's true. Or even kind. They know what's going on. And it's hurting them. Especially Roberta. Then I think about my mother and father, and God knows they had their ups and downs. Somehow they worked it out. I feel I ought to be able to do the same, or else I failed. And I don't like to fail. I don't know what to do about it.
Maybe you love your wife more than you realize.
No. Not for a long time now. The only thing we've got left in common is the same address.
I'm not pressing you, Mel. I wouldn't play that kind of game with you. But I think I'd better take that job in San Francisco.
It's this last line of Tanya's that reveals the film's thesis about her and Mel's relationship. I wouldn't play that kind of game with you. Tanya sets herself apart from the other women in Mel's life, implying that they attempt to control him and dictate the decisions he makes about his career and for his family. Tanya, like Gwen, is accessible both in terms of her proximity to Mel and her emotional availability. She even goes so far as to say that her investment in their relationship is part of what drove her decision to transfer to San Francisco in the first place. Her decision to leave would remove the temptation to cheat on his wife on Mel's part, but it's insinuated that Tanya would still continue to live with the weight of the unrealized potential of their relationship. Another important figure in the narrative is Ada Quonset, an elderly serial stowaway who's been apprehended trying to sneak onto a TGA flight without a ticket. She's been brought to Tanya in the hopes that she can be convinced to stop, but Quonset seems unfazed by Tanya and Mel's threats of prosecution. She also says something interesting about Tanya upon learning that she's a widow.
My late husband was a lawyer, and he always said, watch out for sweet-looking, innocent little old ladies. I'm beginning to understand what he meant.
So you're a widow, too. Oh, I'm sorry, my dear, but you're young and attractive, and I'm sure.
Let's confine the conversation to you, Mrs. Quonset.
Mrs. Quonset goes out of her way to reaffirm Tanya's eligibility, making her and Mel's conversation about her imminent transfer all the more devastating to Mel. The perfect substitute to his overbearing wife is right there, but she's slipping out of his grasp by the second. Isn't that such an injustice? Won't somebody please think of the straight men? Anyway, the juxtaposition of Tanya and Mrs. Quonset does a lot to highlight the reasons that Mel is attracted to Tanya. Both of these women are clearly very smart, but Tanya's ability to more or less keep up with Mrs. Quonset's tricks really illustrates to the audience what Mel finds so captivating about her, and why he's so reluctant to accept her departure. Next, we're introduced to the film's eventual antagonist, D.O. Guerrero, a former construction worker who's down on his luck and desperate for money. He tells his wife Inez that he has found a new job in Milwaukee and sets off for Lincoln with his attaché case. When he arrives, he purchases a life insurance policy for $225,000, payable to his wife in the event that something happens to the plane that he's flying on. That's more foreshadowing. Inez, meanwhile, finds a letter addressed to Dio from a travel agency, suggesting that he purchased a ticket to Rome without telling her. Knowing how desperate her husband is for money, and considering his odd handling of the attaché case upon his departure, she connects the dots and rushes to the airport in the hopes of intercepting her husband before he does anything drastic. But she's too late, and Dio is already on his way to carry out his plan. While conducting their pre-flight checks of the plane, Gwen sends Vern down for a conversation about their relationship. She reveals that she's pregnant, and Vern suggests an abortion. But since it's 1970, and that's still technically illegal in the US, she's adamant that she wants to keep the pregnancy, stating that she's excited about the prospect of motherhood. Yet, that's the first bit of foreshadowing that I told you about. Vern is stunned by this news and seems unsure about the idea of Gwen going through with the pregnancy, to say the least, but resolves to talk it over with her when the plane lands in Rome. As passengers board the plane, Mrs. Quonset sneaks away from the TGA agent Tanya tasked with preventing her from surreptitiously boarding another plane. She tells the gate agent that her son is on the plane, but he's left his wallet behind, and the gate agent just waves her through. This, of course, is a fabrication, and Quonset takes a seat on the plane right next to the visibly nervous Guerrero. Inez, desperately hoping to intercept her husband, arrives at the airport moments too late. The plane departs, and she searches frantically for someone to warn about Dio's plan. The trope of the swooning, hysterical woman is one that's been used and overused in a variety of narrative situations since time immemorial, but feels particularly insidious here. Inez, rightfully distraught at the notion that her husband is a would-be suicide bomber, especially before the idea of bombing a plane hadn't really tangibly entered the American public consciousness, is portrayed as overwrought and histrionic. Tanya is eventually able to get the full story from Inez and contacts air traffic control, who in turn alerts the pilots aboard the plane, including Vern. They collectively decide to turn the plane around without alerting the passengers in an effort to convince Guerrero that nothing is amiss, but he sees through this ruse and rushes to the plane's lavatory with the attaché case in tow. Gwen gives chase, but she's too late. Guerrero detonates the bomb, tearing open the plane's fuselage and causing explosive decompression. Gwen is caught in the blast and falls unconscious, and the rest of the passengers begin to panic. We're once again reminded that Gwen is pregnant, which adds an extra layer of fragility to her character. The plane's extensive damage forces Vern to return to Lincoln for an emergency landing, and in doing so, he radios Mel to request runway 29, which she'll remember is the one with the snowbound 707. Mel tells ground crews to attempt to push the plane off the runway, but Petroni saves the day by overtaxing the plane's engine and forcing it up and over the snowdrift just in the nick of time. Vern lands the plane, Inez, still hysterical, apologizes to the disembarking passengers for her husband's crime, and Vern rushes off with the emergency crews transporting Gwen to the hospital. Unsurprisingly, he's now warmed up to the idea of her going through with the pregnancy. Ada Quonset gets free lifetime tickets on TGA, but says that it was much more fun the other way, and to close out the film, Mel and Tanya go to Tanya's apartment for breakfast. Airport, as a film, is very clearly far from perfect, but its influence on later films can't be overstated. In fact, it was so influential on the disaster film genre that Airplane, the film that many argue caused the death of the genre as it existed in the 70s, is pretty much a beat-for-beat parody of it. The film was also a massive commercial success, making $128.4 million at the box office off a $10.2 million budget, and Helen Hayes, who played Ada Quonset, even won an Oscar for her performance. The critical response to Airport was, however, slightly less favorable, and I find myself agreeing with a lot of the critiques offered. Pauline Kael of The New Yorker writes, "Every stereotyped action is followed by a stereotyped reaction, cliches commenting on cliches. The actors play roles as responsible, harried executive, understanding mistress, spoiled selfish wife, man who needs someone to care for, and the someone." Kael goes on to applaud Maureen Stapleton's performance as Inez, stating that although she manages to bring some intensity out of herself, it certainly isn't in the lines. Kael's review goes on to show that the character's treatment of its characters, particularly its women, isn't just disappointing to 21st century viewers, it's been recognized as an issue since the film's release. That said, I don't mean to disparage the film in its entirety. The production design shows a close attention to detail that I feel like a lot of films nowadays just don't have, which is honestly very refreshing to see. Airport also takes a lot of its cues from earlier film movements, such as the noir movement of the late 1930s and 40s. If you're familiar with movies like Double Indemnity or The Maltese Falcon, you can see the parallels between the way that each of these films are shot and written. A lot of Airport's dialogue follows the conventions set by mystery and thriller films of the early 20th century, especially when it comes to Mel and Tanya's dialogue. Overall, Airport is a film with merits and flaws just like any other, and given its financial success and its new place in the cultural consciousness, it would go on to have a very tangible influence on later entries in the disaster film genre, whatever that might mean for their cultural impact and narrative quality. The next film I want to talk about is 1972's The Poseidon Adventure, directed by Ronald Neame and produced by Irwin Allen, who would later go on to produce The Towering Inferno, which we'll talk about later. The film follows the passengers of a cruise ship bound for Athens as it capsizes on New Year's Eve, and the ragtag group of survivors that must make a perilous journey through this rapidly sinking ship to have any chance at survival. The film opens with a title card that states that the events of the film are a retelling of a true story, but this is just a framing device. This did not happen. The action begins on the ship's bridge, where we learn that the ship's captain wants to take on more ballast in preparation for an upcoming storm, but the representative from the ship's parent company won't let him. I had no idea what ballast was when I first watched this movie. I don't know anything about boats, but I looked it up. It's a fancy way of saying letting water into the hull of the boat to make it heavier so that it doesn't capsize. But clearly that goes great for them. Meanwhile, we're introduced to our main characters, Mr. and Mrs. Rogo, a detective and his wife, Belle and Manny, a couple on their way to meet their grandchild in Israel, Robin and Susan, a brother-sister duo, Nani, the ship's singer, Martin, an elderly widower, and finally Reverend Scott, the film's protagonist and a traveling preacher. Reverend Scott mentions that he's been ousted from his previous position as a pastor for his avant-garde preaching style and has been sent by his elders to minister in Africa. While he's aware that this is an effort on the part of his superiors to get him to conform, he embraces the opportunity wholeheartedly. He mentions frequently that he believes that God helps those who help themselves, a line which will not only foreshadow his eventual role as the de facto leader of the would-be escapees, but signals an interesting phenomenon in disaster film writing. Much in the same way that Airport scrutinizes and critiques expressions of femininity, the Poseidon Adventure makes statements about masculinity that do a lot to help viewers understand the genre. Each of the male characters in this film takes charge of their own wants and what they believe is best for themselves and the people around them in a way that the female characters can't. From the very beginning of the film, even young Robin is unafraid to venture to the ship's bridge alone, simply to ask the captain to show him how the ship operates. The passengers gather in the ship's dining room for New Year's dinner, Mrs. Rogo is battling seasickness, Nani and her brother provide music, and the rest of the passengers whom we've been introduced to thus far are enjoying the New Year's celebrations. However, on the bridge, a crew member alerts the captain of an approaching tsunami. The captain attempts to issue a distress signal, but it's too late. The ship is struck broadside and capsizes. The entire dining room is now upside down, and the ship's hull is above water. Scott attempts to convince the rest of the passengers to accompany him through the ship toward the hull, which is only 1 inch thick, and as a result, Scott is convinced that he can breach it somehow. With his bare hands, presumably? I don't know. It's not really addressed. I don't know. What matters is that he believes he can do it. I guess. With the entire ship in chaos, one of the ship's crew members asks everyone to stay put and not to follow Scott on his extremely dangerous and poorly thought out expedition. But since Reverend Scott is #not like other girls, he assembles a group of supporters who just so happen to conveniently be the very people we've been introduced through the film's exposition. Scott and company attempt to devise a plan to reach what is now the top of the dining room, where Susan and a waiter named Akers are currently trapped. The group discovers that they can use the ship's Christmas tree as a makeshift ladder in order to reach Susan and Akers while making their way to the galley. But just as each of them finally reaches the relative safety of the kitchen, a series of explosions in the ship's now submerged exhaust stacks floods the dining room with water, presumably killing everyone who decided to stay put. Scott, sticking to his God helps those who help themselves motto in a horrifically morbid, on-the-nose fashion, proceeds to shut the galley door on them so that he won't have to listen to them drown in what may be the most hilariously edited scene I've seen in a good while. Scott decides to attempt to lead the group to the ship's engine room, and along the way, Akers is killed in another explosion. The remaining survivors encounter another group, and Detective Rogo gives Scott an ultimatum: find the engine room in 15 minutes, or he joins the other group. Scott does eventually find the engine room, although not within Rogo's time limit, but Rogo stays anyway. It's clear that the men in this film are the ones who drive the plot. The women around them are wives, sisters, performers. They can't really be contextualized outside of their relationships to the men closer to the center of the story. However, where this film differs from Airport is visible through the degree of agency afforded to each of the film's protagonists. While the events of Airport largely happened around or at Mel Bakersfeld, Reverend Scott, and to a lesser extent Mr. Rogo, take a far more active role in determining the fate of their group and thus how the story will progress. Mel and Joe Petroni are able to save the day through quick thinking and disregard for convention, but this trope is replicated and magnified tenfold through Reverend Scott. It's his idea to lead the passengers to the hull of the ship, and it's established that his disregard for the rules is a fundamental part of his character. God helps those who help themselves, and Scott will do everything he can to make sure that he's able to help himself. Scott, having completed Rogo's challenge to find the engine room, informs the group that their destination is separated from them by a flooded corridor. Knowing that they'll have to swim through to get to the engine room, Belle informs Scott that she used to be a competitive swimmer and is more or less confident in her ability to make the journey first and scout out the engine room, but Scott rebuffs her and attempts to traverse the passage himself. However, he becomes trapped by falling debris, and Belle dives into the water in an attempt to extract him. She succeeds, but suffers a fatal heart attack upon resurfacing. Rogo leads the rest of the group through the flooded passage, and Manny expresses that without Belle, he feels he can't continue the journey out of the ship. However, he's re-emboldened by Scott when he gives him Belle's high pendant to give to their grandson. This scene is particularly notable within the disaster film canon due to Belle's actions. In Airport, the only woman shown to have any real capability is Tanya, who is young and able to complement but not compete with Mel's authority. Belle, however, is an older woman who doesn't fit the young, thin, all-American archetype. Nevertheless, she's able to put her life on the line and save the film's protagonist from mortal peril. Considering this film's treatment of masculinity and its writing thus far, Belle's characterization and ultimately her sacrifice for Scott and the rest of the crew stands out as all the more emotionally impactful. It also highlights a glaring flaw in Scott's logic. Scott repeatedly falls back on his "God helps those who help themselves" motto, but taking matters into his own hands often endangers his life and the lives of those around him. But Belle's actions save Scott's life, and he is forced to re-examine his role as the leader of the group of survivors and his capability to save them by himself. After convincing Manny to rejoin the group following Belle's death, the group finds the watertight door that leads to the ship's propeller room. But before they can reach it, another series of explosions breaks open a steam valve that blocks the path to the door and causes Mrs. Rogo to fall to her death. Mr. Rogo, furious at Scott for allowing his arrogance to cause the death of his wife, along with Belle and other passengers, berates Scott and laments the apparent hopelessness of the remaining survivors' situation. Scott, however, jumps across a pool of flaming oil and grabs a steam valve to allow the rest of the group to reach the hull and escape, at the cost of his life. Scott blames God for the deaths that occurred under his leadership of the group and urges Rogo to lead the group to safety. Rogo does so just as Scott falls to his death. Having reached the hull, the group attempts to attract the attention of the individuals they can hear working on the other side of it. A rescue team cuts through the hull, with tools, not their bare hands, notably, and pulls the survivors to safety, and the film ends with the group being flown away from the wreckage as they are informed that they are the only survivors. The Poseidon Adventure is a very interesting film, not just in terms of the action that happens on screen, but as an entry in the disaster film genre. Airport was far too focused on the details of its plot to give much in the way of an overarching metatextual message, but the Poseidon Adventure surprisingly has a lot to say about collectivism and how traditional displays of authority can undermine a common goal. Reverend Scott, from the very beginning, is characterized as a man with strong disregard for the rules, but his displays of capability toe the line into arrogance and at times negligent endangerment of the well-being of his fellow survivors. As we discussed with Belle's actions to save Scott's life, this film takes special care to show us that even though Scott's blasé attitude toward the opinions of others has allowed him to carve his own path thus far, he's still very much reliant on the abilities and goodwill of others to survive. At the end of the day, in such a high-stakes situation, such as a rapidly sinking ocean liner, those who help themselves can't rely on God to save them. They've got to help each other. The Poseidon Adventure was a great commercial success, earning a worldwide gross of $125 million on a $4.7 million budget. Critics' opinions were, as a general rule, more favorable toward the Poseidon Adventure than they were to Airport, as many of the clunkier elements of Airport, such as the pacing and the number of plot lines, were more or less ironed out in the Poseidon Adventure. Charles Champlin of the LA Times writes, "Are the characters as gaudy and thin as cereal boxes? Is the dialogue banal and shrill? Is the moralizing heavy-handed and relentless? Is the hokum a bit thick, even in the concept of a showmanship special? Well, yes. But who cares?" By this point, the disaster film formula had been established in the movie-going consciousness, and it was generally accepted that films like the Poseidon Adventure were more focused on awing the viewer with fantastic visuals and melodrama than delivering a cogent, grounded plot. Champlin's review distills this principle down to its very core. If a film has less than stellar writing, as long as it has sufficiently dazzling visuals, who cares? A film's visuals can do a lot for the audience's experience. From foreshadowing to subtextual storytelling through production design and costume, the visual elements of disaster films are instantly recognizable and remain some of the defining hallmarks of the genre. The final film I'd like to look at today is 1974's The Towering Inferno. Directed by John Gillerman and produced by Irwin Allen, who also produced The Poseidon Adventure, the film details the opening of a new San Francisco skyscraper and the ensuing fire that claims the lives of nearly everyone inside. The film stars Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Fred Astaire, Faye Dunaway, and O.J. Simpson, and was even nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture at the 1974 Oscars. The Towering Inferno's production design is notable in that it serves a very active role in the plot's progression, especially given the film's focus on the architecture of the titular tower. The film opens with Paul Newman's character, Doug Roberts, as he attends a meeting to discuss the dedication of the glass tower, which has achieved the distinction of being the tallest building in the world. Roberts, an architect, is expected to assist with the dedication ceremony, along with James Duncan, the developer for whom Roberts designed the building, and Roger Simmons, the building's electrical contractor and Duncan's son-in-law. From the very first glimpses we see of the tower, it's clear that this building is an architectural marvel, with an abundance of glass to let in the California sunshine and sweeping cavernous spaces taken as a cue from the brutalist movement. The tower's futuristic aesthetics and unity of design signal to the audience the depth of Robert's skill as an architect. But even so, the set also foreshadows the disaster that will imperil the characters we've just been introduced to. The dominant color throughout the set is orange. Orange walls, orange carpet, orange textiles. The building is saturated in warm shades as a sort of omen of the fire that will ultimately destroy it. Further, the abundance of natural materials like potted plants imply just how vulnerable the building really is to the threat of fire. Another visual element in the film's opening scenes that I'd like to mention is Doug Roberts' costume. In this scene, he's the only character not wearing business attire. He's dressed very casually given the circumstances, but this manner of dress combined with his down-to-earth mannerisms make him far more accessible to the audience than Duncan or Simmons. Roberts is an everyman, a man who works with his hands and knows this building inside and out, having taken the time to design it and lead its construction. Additionally, his orange t-shirt links him to the tower he built, uniting him with it and incorporating his presence into its very design. As preparations for the dedication ceremony get underway, a routine safety check is conducted to ensure the building's utility systems are operational for its grand opening. But unbeknownst to security personnel, this safety check causes an electrical fire in a maintenance closet on the building's 81st floor. This fire, though small and easily managed in its current state, goes unnoticed and unaddressed until it threatens to claim the building and the lives of everyone in it. This negligence will form the central thesis of the film, especially as it offers arguments on the nature of excess and efficiency over the human elements of design. This test also causes a short circuit in the tower's main utility room, which Roberts does notice. He suspects that Simmons cut corners on the building's electrical installations, but Simmons claims otherwise. This marks the beginning of an antagonism between Roberts and Simmons that continues throughout the film. Both men firmly believe that their approach to the tower's management is the correct one, but their ideological conflicts act as a vehicle for the film's statements on extravagance. As the dedication ceremony begins, the tower is illuminated using all of its interior lights, showcasing the prominence of glass in the design in a brilliant display. A ceremonial ribbon is cut, but the novelty scissors used to do so don't split the ribbon on the first try, a portent of disaster. Aware of the strain that this lighting display will put on the building's electrical systems, Roberts orders some of the lights to be shut off. Ceremony attendees outside the building notice smoke emanating from the building's 81st floor, the source of the fire, and the fire department is called to the scene. Roberts leads Giddings, one of the building's engineers, to the 81st floor, but upon opening the maintenance closet where the fire has grown exponentially by this point, Giddings is killed by the flames. The visual element of the fire rushing out of the maintenance closet fulfills the implication set forth by the set's design. The warm colors and natural elements have been swallowed up by the fire, which will now spread rapidly throughout the building. Roberts rushes to the building's 135th floor, where a reception for the dedication is being held in the promenade room. The design of this room takes the principles we talked about with the rest of the tower's design and multiplies them tenfold. The abundance of plants, rattan furniture, and even the lattice on the stage is especially ominous, knowing now what we know about the state of the fire. The room is opulently decorated and clearly designed to impress not just the partygoers, but the movie-going audience as well. It's clear that no expense was spared, both within the canon of the story and within the film's production. Roberts makes a beeline for Duncan to tell him about the fire and Giddings' death, but Duncan refuses to order an evacuation because he's trying to impress the senator and earn an urban renewal contract for further developments. Duncan's commitment to ensuring the dedication ceremony goes smoothly takes precedence over the safety of the tower's occupants and underscores the hubristic excess that causes the tower's destruction. The tower itself can even be read as an allegory for the sinking of the Titanic. Duncan's repeated assertions that a fatal disaster could not happen in this building call to mind the unsinkable ship and its ultimate destruction. Roberts is incensed at Duncan's lack of urgency, but San Francisco Fire Department Chief Michael O'Halloran, played by Steve McQueen, arrives and forces Duncan to evacuate all guests from the building. In the ensuing chaos, Simmons, the building's electrical contractor, who we saw earlier, admits to Duncan that he cut corners in designing the building's electrical systems in order to reduce costs, and implies that other subcontractors did the same. The costume design in the promenade room scenes is elaborate and meticulously constructed, and serves not only to illustrate the excess that will be the downfall of Duncan's achievement, but also to highlight the antagonism between Roberts and Simmons. Throughout the film thus far, Roberts wears orange. As I've mentioned, this ties him to the tower and underscores his connection to it. But in this scene, it establishes his character as a diametrical opponent to Simmons. Simmons is dressed in blue, which sits opposite the orange on the traditional color wheel. This costuming choice suggests to the audience that not only is Simmons the antithesis of Roberts and his goals, but is also an enemy to the well-being of the tower itself. On a more basic level, Simmons' blue suit lets the viewer know that his decision to cut corners, and by extension his continued presence within the tower, is a direct threat to Robert's authority as architect and as the film's leading man. Guests begin to leave the promenade room via the express elevators, but one elevator becomes trapped on the now fully ablaze 81st floor, killing everyone aboard. By this point, another fire has started on the 65th floor and killed 2 employees working in the Duncan Enterprises office there. Roberts attempts to aid fire crews in containing the fire on the lower floor, but a gas line ruptures and destroys a nearby stairwell, so Roberts is forced to use another express elevator to make his way back up to the promenade room. The elevator doors open on the 134th floor to reveal the door to the promenade room sealed shut, so Roberts traverses the building's ventilation systems to make his way back to the larger group of survivors. A helicopter rescue is attempted, but fails when the helicopter crashes into the building's roof, making the fire that much worse. These poor people truly just cannot win. I mean, I know it's a disaster movie, but especially with this one, I just reached a certain point where I'm like, can these people just not catch a break? After the helicopter fiasco, the rescue team rigs up something called a breeches buoy, which is essentially a life preserver attached to a zip line, to shuttle everyone still stuck in the promenade room to the roof of a nearby but slightly shorter skyscraper. Meanwhile, Simmons has the bright idea to attempt to escape the promenade room via the stairwell, which goes exactly as well for him as you think it would. Simmons' wife, however, has escaped the building via the breeches buoy. Roberts modifies the building's scenic elevator to operate with a gravity brake, allowing 1 trip down for 12 survivors. But because these people just cannot win, another explosion stops the elevator in its tracks and throws one of the passengers out of the elevator to her death. But in the first lucky break of this entire movie, O'Halloran uses another helicopter to rescue the remaining passengers and bring them to safety. By this point, the fire has reached the promenade room and everyone still trapped there is getting desperate. Simmons attempts to commandeer the breeches buoy, but it is destroyed in yet another explosion and Simmons is killed. Seeing all these random explosions, Roberts devises a plan to use plastic explosives to destroy the water tanks on the building's roof in order to extinguish the fire. This works, improbably, but the day is saved. O'Halloran offers to show Roberts how to design a fireproof building and drives away into the horizon as the credits roll. Many reviewers criticize the Towering Inferno for the heavy-handedness of its messaging, which, yeah, fair. It's also nearly 3 hours long, which does get a little grating, especially with all the explosions. Although, honestly, I think the most effective message this film has to offer is that if you're a screenwriter and you've written yourself into a corner, just throw in a well-timed explosion and your problems are solved. Gene Siskel called the Towering Inferno a stunt and not a story. It's a technical achievement more concerned with special effects than with people. That's why our attitude toward the film's cardboard characters is, let them burn. But despite the laborious runtime and the hand-fisted writing, most critics agree that the film's visuals are some of the most impressive the disaster film genre has to offer. The attention to detail in the sets and costume design is nothing short of incredible, and it's clear through the film's concept art that a lot of care went into crafting such a fantastic and narratively compelling spectacle. The Towering Inferno is my favorite of the disaster films I've watched, and I've seen a lot of them, and it's the visuals that keep me coming back to it. It's just so quintessentially 70s, and everything from the design of the promenade room, to the costumes, to the atriums, does so much to immerse viewers in the era. Is the Towering Inferno a good film? Objectively, maybe not. Although it did win 3 Oscars, but I would argue that it's so kitschy that it wraps all the way back around being cool again. It's like Horseshoe Theory, but for bad movies. It's so bad that it transcends traditional definitions of bad and wraps itself so completely in an element of camp that's equal parts intentional and unintentional that the end product has you on the edge of your seat, even though you probably know how it's going to end. That's a principle that applies to most disaster films and ultimately became the genre's downfall. From Airport onwards, the genre established a set of tropes that were reinforced ad nauseum throughout the 1970s. Airplane, which was released in 1970, was a direct, almost plot point for plot point parody of Airport and subverted and poked fun at all of the most iconic disaster film tropes, from infidelity to hysterical crowds to overly confident leading men. By the time of Airplane's release, the tropes that defined the genre had solidified into cliché, and audiences grew tired of seeing the same plot points played out with different set dressing. But these elements wouldn't disappear in the 1980s, far from it. Common disaster film or disaster film adjacent writing styles and directorial sensibilities are on plain view in films like Terminator, war games, and even horror flicks like Alien. An existential threat to a group of people who are more or less trapped in the space they inhabit makes for a compelling story, no matter if it takes place on a capsized cruise liner full of passengers or on a desolate mining spaceship and its skeleton crew. Die Hard is perhaps the best example of disaster film cliches being applied to an updated but still uniquely 80s formula. Bruce Willis's character's journey through the building's vents is a direct reference to Doug Roberts' HVAC crawl to the promenade room. The recodification of the stylistic elements popularized by disaster films into science fiction and action films also does a lot to reflect the shifting cultural climate of the Reagan administration. As the Vietnam War ended and the mainstream American political consciousness became less concerned with the U.S.'s perpetuation of atrocities abroad and more concerned with issues closer to home, such as the threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union and the AIDS crisis, films released during this shift began to reflect the anxieties that caused it. War Games is an excellent example. The strong anti-nuclear sentiments of the film's writing, combined with the disaster the film's protagonists are attempting to avert, takes disaster film cliches a step further and asks an essential question of the genre. How do you stop a disaster that hasn't happened yet? War Games' answer to this question is, of course, to play tic-tac-toe with a computer, but that's neither here nor there. The genre also experienced a bit of a resurgence in the 1990s, with the release of films like Twister, Deep Impact, and Armageddon. There's something to be said for the impact of the trend cycle on film releases. Just like fashion choices seem to ebb in and out of vogue every 20 years or so do movie tropes a lot of the time. The 1990s and early 2000s were also a time of rapid development for computer-generated imaging technology. Tools like motion capture and polygonal mesh animation enabled filmmakers to incorporate types of effects that, in years past, had to be done with miniatures or other practical effects like on-set pyrotechnics or stunt work. CGI, however, removed some of the need for costly practical effects and stunt training and created some pretty interesting but still very 90s visual styles. We're at the point in the trend cycle now where genre fatigue for disaster films prevents many new big-budget entries from being released. Most of the disaster-oriented films that come out now are straight-to-Netflix schlock like The Meg or Fall, which my mother recently described as terrible. It remains to be seen whether or not the genres that seem to dominate our current movie market will go the way of the disaster film. We may yet see an airplane-style parody of a genre like the multiverse superhero franchise that might take the genre even more than it already is. In conclusion, disaster films from the 70s provide a fascinating window into a film movement whose influences are still visible in the films we enjoy today. While they're far from perfect, the narrative and visual hallmarks of the genre come together to create a uniquely charming, if at times frustrating, body of work that serves as a testament to a style of filmmaking that seems more out of reach now than ever. With the saturation of CGI and modern movie visuals and the emergence of AI as a scriptwriting and even a casting tool, it's very easy to look at films like Airport and wonder at the time and effort it took to create such an elaborate film from scratch. But maybe now, with the disillusionment that so many of us feel in the midst of the uncertain path the film industry seems to be headed on, we can appreciate the craftsmanship and care that went into films like these and use it to inspire new works, and maybe even a new generation of filmmakers to fall in love with the spectacle of it all. But maybe this time we can let the characters who aren't white men be happy. I don't know. It's just a thought.